This is Self-Work, and I'm Dr. Margaret Rutherford. At Self-Work, we'll discuss psychological and emotional issues common in today's world and what to do about them. I'm Dr. Margaret, and Self-Work is a podcast dedicated to you taking just a few minutes today for your own self-work. Hello and welcome back to Self-Work. I'm Dr. Margaret Rutherford. I'm a clinical psychologist, and we've been doing self-work now for 6.5 years. I wanted to extend the walls of my practice to those of you who are already interested in psychological or emotional issues. Maybe you're in therapy, but also to those of you who might be looking for answers. Maybe you're wondering if something's wrong or you're having a problem that you might like to develop a little more insight around. But also to a third group of you, to those of you who think mental health treatment or therapy is kind of wackadoodle. I'm here to talk to you about that and see what you think after you listen to Self-Work. We've got a couple of fantastic interviews for you this week, as I'm honored to speak at a couple of meetings. One for clinicians about what I'm terming perfectly hidden addiction, and one for a group of construction workers on hidden depression and the movement to recognize suicidal thinking as a normal human response to something that feels intolerably painful. But more on that later. In fact, we've been talking about that here on Self-Work in the last couple of episodes. I love it when an author reaches out to me themselves, and that's what Brooke Siem did. I didn't have to talk with a bunch of publicity or marketing people. She knows exactly what her message is and who needs to hear it. Plus, I was mesmerized by her writing, her actual writing. She's a really evocative author, and her book is worth the read for that fact alone. The name of her book is called May Cause Side Effects. It's the first memoir on antidepressant withdrawal to hit the mass market, a notable milestone in the journey to bring global awareness to antidepressant withdrawal, actually withdrawal from any medication, but especially in this instance, antidepressants. Not everyone on antidepressants wants to stay on them forever, and it's imperative that both patients and doctors recognize that antidepressant withdrawal can be tough, and then the doctor practice safe, what she calls deprescribing. I couldn't agree more. It takes time. Nobody should go off cold turkey. Her mission is also to shift the narrative of depression as a chronic ailment to one that frames depression as a temporary human experience. And certainly that can be true. I think both are true, but certainly maybe there's more emphasis, especially in advertising, on take a med because you're depressed. Let's make sure no one is hearing you shouldn't be on antidepressants. That's not the case. They can be very helpful, but there are side effects often, and getting off of them can be very difficult for some people. It's hard to tell in Brooke's memoir how much her own chaotic upbringing led to many of her experiences when she was withdrawing and what was actual withdrawal. So I do think you have to take that with a grain of salt. But I've had many clients tell me that getting off some med or another has taken them quite a long time. Here's a fun fact. She was also a Food Network Chopped champion, and we talk about that, and actually competed on the show while in antidepressant withdrawal. She can be found all over the internet at Brooke Siem. That's BROOKESIEM, and I think you'll thoroughly enjoy her interview. First, let's hear from one of our wonderful sponsors who, when you buy their products, that helps me defray the costs of self-work. Plus, I use the products and think they're great. This sponsor is Athletic Greens, and I take them every morning. What better time than now to decide that you're going to do something for yourself in 2023 that will only add to your sense of well-being, where you can begin every single day with an act of true self-care, not a bubble bath, not even a therapy session, but by drinking one glass full of 75 high-quality minerals, vitamins, probiotics, adaptogens, and whole food sourced superfoods, which support everything from your gut to your immune system to your energy level. I use it every day and love this habit because if you're like me, self-care can get lost in a day full of kids, work, meals, and whatever else comes along. AG1 knows that people who listen to self-work are seeking to make their lives better. So Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 travel packs with your first purchase. Become your own green machine in the first hour you're up and around. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/selfwork. Again, That's athleticgreens.com/selfwork to take ownership of your health in 2023 and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. And now, here's the interview with Brooke Siem on may cause side effects. Brooke, I just told you that, welcome to Self Work, by the way. I just told you that I spent the whole ride from Northwest Arkansas to LA to visit our son and LA back home and reading your book. And I was really mesmerized by it. I think it's one of the most different books I've ever read. I don't think I can compare it to anything that I've read recently, at least.
Oh, well, thank you for that. I really spent a long time crafting it. So it was as much about the craft of the book for me as it was about the message.
Well, it shows. I mean, I have things dog-eared in here that I want to talk to you about because some of the explanations are so beautiful. But tell Self-Work listeners a little bit about who you are, and the name of the book is May Cause Side Effects. And tell us what made you write the book. Who are you?
Sure. So my name is Brooke Siem, and I am the author of May Cause Side Effects, and it is the first memoir on antidepressant withdrawal to hit the consumer market. So that's a really important thing because antidepressant withdrawal is something that affects a huge amount of people.
Yes, it does.
But there has not been a ton of press or even awareness of it in the mainstream. And so this book feels like one of the first steps in getting this to be a more recognized thing and to help both prescribers understand what antidepressant withdrawal can look like, to help patients understand what it can feel like, and also to know that somebody else has been through it. And at the end of the day, it's a book about hope. It's a book about recovery because antidepressant withdrawal can last for a very long time for people, and it's an extremely lonely place to be. And so I know that I wasn't sure I was going to get out of it in the year that my book takes place. Mm-hmm. And so effectively, I wrote the book I wish I'd had at that time.
Well, it is really a vital reference for people. I remember the first person who told me that it took 7 years for them to get off of Klonopin, for example. And another young man comes to mind that, gosh, this was so early in my practice, and the doctor had put him on Effexor, which I now, if somebody might get mad at me in the pharmaceutical world, but Effexor has, for many people, has bad side effects and very difficult to get off of for most people. And I remember he said, I had these brain zaps and I had to go look it up, and I sure enough, there they were. And so, but I didn't know about them. Yeah. And so you're right. I think that the vast majority of people don't understand that these things can really, and you point out at the end of the book, don't go to cold turkey for sure. In fact, there's a way to do it that's at least the safest. But now you are also a writer, correct?
Yes.
And that shows. Another thread or a major thread through your book was your relationship with your dad and your mom.
Yeah.
And I am always interested in family and how they affected who you are, and you write some beautiful things about it. But tell us a little bit about your growing up.
Sure. I grew up in Reno, Nevada, pretty typical suburban middle class background. I was the only child of a couple of bill collectors and ethical bill collectors. I mean, my mom is a light. If you read the book, she's just she's kind of like a fairy come down to earth. She's just this very ascended soul, and she just loves everyone, and she sees the good in everything. And it's
hard to see her as a bill collector.
I know, but she created this unbelievable company where it was like everybody was being helped. It wasn't about, it wasn't the traditional, we're gonna screw you and take your wages. It was more like, how do we help you out of this? So she really took the light. And so they worked together, and, it was fairly standard growing up. And then my father suddenly passed away when I was 15. So he had pancreatic cancer, but we didn't know he had it. And so he went in for an ulcer surgery and never came out. And yeah.
Well, you said that though it was fairly usual growing up, but your dad had a temper, and he had some strange Holmes Strange. Yeah. So, can you describe him to us?
Sure.
Sounded almost haunted in some ways.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where when you lose a parent as a teenager, I never knew him as an adult. So there's so many questions that I have. And, my mom knows some of them, but, the whole side of the family's gone now too. So he's still a little bit of an enigma to me, but he was very much a barrel of a man, kind of a bull in a china shop type person. He had this huge heart. And if you accepted him for who he was just, he could make you laugh until you cry. And he was a teddy bear. And I always felt so loved by him. And at the same time, he had this unbelievable temper and almost rage for being alive. It's like he didn't want to be here. And so that always came out. It was never directed at me personally. So I kind of grew up with it thinking it was normal because I was never, hit or hurt in any way, but I would see the garbage cans getting hit and hurt and, the washing machine. And so it was very cacophonous growing up. And, I think that I very much internalized a lot of that. And, it's hard to separate, what the nurture versus nature here. But in either case, I think I was probably born with a lot of that anger as well. And also saw it as a normal expression of the deep emotion. But then I was not really allowed to feel that, when he died so suddenly, and then I was so suddenly put on a cocktail of antidepressants. It's like all of that emotion was just squashed and numbed away. And that was one of the biggest challenges of withdrawal for me, was this huge amount of rage that came up and just the terror of that, because I had never really felt that before.
Right. And you asked the question a lot because you were having these very emotional and actually sometimes psychotic experiences of coming off the drugs. And you would say, wait a minute, is this me? Is this withdrawal? I mean, that question keeps coming up. And you touched on some of the stuff, because your dad's father had also had a lot of emotional outbursts and had thrown him into the fire, I think, at one point, something like that. And so you're talking about the jargon for it in psychology is transgenerational trauma. But I loved this definition of it. For anyone who's reading the book, it's on page 138. You say, at least now I'm no longer scared. I know this part of me exists. I know I wasn't so much born with it as much I was born of it. This remembering etched not only into me, but into the tender soul of every human who ever was and ever will be. I know the deepest cavern of my mind is filled with the horror and pain and sorrow of everything that came before me. I just loved that definition, or that description, not a definition, that description of what transgenerational trauma can find like. That it is, you were born of it, not with it.
I often think that, a more philosophical definition of depression could be a remembering, like a cellular remembering of everything that's happened to humanity and the earth. And I think that for particularly sensitive people, you walk around the world and you feel it. You feel this pain that's always there, even if something has never directly happened to you, or maybe it happened a long time ago. And I find that if we can sort of acknowledge that we carry that with us, it at least really helped me get out of the depression aspect of this, because I realized it wasn't my responsibility to carry.
What you talked about a lot was going to places. You traveled all over the world and you would feel the pain of those places so evocatively that it was just horrific for you. And I hadn't thought about this, but when we were lucky enough to go to Sicily back in October, and we went up to these places where they would have the gladiator fights. And my husband was looking all around, and is this interesting? And I just felt this horrible sadness and pain. And and I'm not particularly as sensitive to that kind of thing as you are, but I just remember thinking, this is a monument to people being horrific toward other people. So I don't know. I guess I wasn't much fun, but you know what? I couldn't be anything different. And I think you had those experiences over and over and over.
And I was in places that were so well known for terrible things, genocide, Cambodia or the Balkans. And so I was so aware of it. But when you think about, I mean, I'm in kind of a deserty area too here in Reno, but if I think of, I don't know what happened here, 200 years ago, 2000 years ago. Mm-hmm. I think that if we can have this experience in a place where we know atrocities have occurred, we can also have it in places where we don't consciously know that something has occurred, but it has, right? And then if you have, a teenager or a kid who's really sensitive and maybe they're picking that up and they don't, but no one knows, right? To me, that kind of explains a little bit of the kind of ephemeral, questionable nature of this, or why some people, feel so afflicted and others don't. I mean, we can debate that all day long, but I like this idea because it just allows me to release a little bit, that it's not me. It's the world. I'm a vessel that the energy is coming through, and I can process it and release it, but I don't have to hold it. And if I don't know why, I don't need to know. I can just know that it is and let that go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So tell me about the decision to write this book.
So that's a funny story. I was thinking about this morning, actually. So, I had spent 15 years on all of these antidepressants from 15 to 30. And during that time, I was still deeply depressed. So when you're in that state of chronic depression for so long, no kind of becomes the default. You're just used to saying or thinking no to everything, even if it's not fully conscious. And so what I started to realize is that as I was going through withdrawal, and by that point I was traveling around the world, my default to everything was no because. And I started to realize that, I had this year of travel. And
as you'd very purposefully taken for this. Right.
Exactly. It was very purposeful. So I had about a year, and around 9 months in, it just dawned on me. I was in Canada, Vancouver, Canada at the time. It just dawned on me that I was spending the majority of my time traveling around in whatever apartment I was in the city I was in, doing puzzles. Now, I love puzzles, so I'm not going to knock them too hard. But the bottom line is I wasn't thriving or really taking advantage of this opportunity. And I didn't know how to kind of create opportunity for myself, or to go out there, and because I'm pretty introverted. I don't, I'm not just going to go fraternize at a bar with strangers. That's not really me. So what was I supposed to do? I was traveling alone at that point. So I decided that I was going to say yes to literally every yes or no question that came my way, regardless of the question, for about 100 days. And I was blogging about it at the time. And it was very, very structured in the sense that I had rules. I couldn't say yes to anything that would ruin me financially, or, like I couldn't get a face tattoo if someone dared me to do it. I wouldn't do anything illegal. There were kind of your general rules, but then everything else I had to say yes to, as simple from, do you want cream and sugar in your coffee, which I typically don't take sugar in my coffee, to, someone asks for change on the street, to, do you want to go to Chile? Like, I said, I'm going to say yes. And I wrote about it. And so, this experience ultimately profoundly changed my life. I didn't realize it at the time. Most of the decisions were fairly benign, very small things, but there were two that really mattered. The first is, I said yes to a date I didn't want to go on, which circuitously put me in a 5-year-long relationship that followed. The second thing is I had a literary agent from my previous life because I owned a bakery in New York, and we had a cookbook, and I was chatting with this literary agent, and she kind of said, you could write about this experience. Like, what if you write about this and I'll try and sell it? Would you do that? And I remember sitting there and I just said, oh God, I guess yes. And so I started writing this book because of this, little experiment I did.
Challenge.
And that was 5 years before it got published. So there was a whole bunch of stuff that happened in between deciding to write a book and writing this book. This book that you can buy on the shelf. This is not the book I set out to write.
Yeah, I know
it kind of came up, but once it came up, I kind of said, oh, this is the book I need to write. I started to see a little bit of, coverage in the mainstream media about antidepressant withdrawal. And I started to say, okay, I think this topic is going to grow over time. And I'm going to be the one to write this book, and I need to do it before somebody else does. So I did it.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of the book Pathological, and I've got it. Sarah Fay is her. I interviewed her several months ago, and she was pointing out that she had received like 7 different diagnoses, all with their accompanying medication over her lifetime. And finally, she went to a psychiatrist, and he looked at her, and rather than giving her her 8th diagnosis, said, "I don't really know what's wrong with you or what's happening with you." And she wrote this book about how so much of it was wrong, and so much of the medication was just thrown at her, and she was left on it with, so there's if you don't know the book, it would be an interesting book for you to look at, because she is trying to sort of a similar hue and cry about we need to look more carefully at this mental health system. And, I went to a program, I was in graduate school 30 years ago now, but I was very surprised, and she was surprised to hear how they did talk about the subjectivity of diagnoses and the subjectivity of, even though we weren't psychiatrists, of medication usage and that kind of thing. So in fact, they had us read I'm Dancing as Fast as I Can, which was a book about benzodiazepine withdrawal. That was very popular. It was made into a movie and all this kind of thing. So I think it was an unusual program because of that.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly don't hear much about withdrawal from doctors. Like when I'm able to have a candid conversation with them about this, which isn't always, but when I'm able to have it, I ask them about their medical school experience, and there's no real classes on deprescribing. I mean, some will say, I might have had a couple hours in a lecture once, but I just think it's at the point now where, it really takes a doctor who is going to go out of their own way to engage in continuing education, to listen to their patients if their patients bring research to them and say, well, what about this? Like, I know what the standard of care is, what the standard protocol is, but what about all this other research that says that's not correct? Like, if you can't have that conversation with your doctor, I think it's time to fire your doctor.
Right. So was there an event that you said, I've got to get off these? Was there something that triggered that desire to, I know the answer because I read the book, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah. It was a very, it was an unremarkable moment in a way, and in other ways it was very remarkable. I had been 15 years of these antidepressants, and I was getting worse. I mean, I was more and more depressed as the years went by. Suicidal thoughts were daily and common, to the point where I didn't even think it was anything to be concerned about. I mean, it was part of my personality, as my brown hair at that point. Right. And I had taken to, I lived on the 30th floor. I had taken to pushing the screen out of my window and just staring at the sidewalk and really thinking about my options. And it didn't scare me at all. And I was so numbed out at that point. I just stood so flat that I just remember looking down, and I was looking at the traffic patterns in the sidewalk and, not going to mince words, thinking about jumping. And then all of a sudden it occurred to me, and I said, I shouldn't be this depressed on this many antidepressants.
Right.
And I just kind of said, I wonder if they're not working, or maybe there's a contributing factor.
Who am I if I'm not on antidepressants?
Yeah.
That question was just all of a sudden sort of a new thought to you.
Because I was put on these drugs before puberty.
Sure.
So I had not really spent a single unmedicated moment in my entire adult life. I realized I had no frame of reference for who I was outside of the 14-year-old whose dad was still alive, right? And so that's kind of the moment. That was the next thought that came in pretty much. And I pulled myself back in from my window, and I just, there was a seismic shift, but nothing was different. And I just said, okay, well, I at least need to, these drugs aren't working. So I thought maybe I needed different ones, but I had the sense to say, I think I need to know what my baseline is as an adult, because I don't like the same things. I don't listen to the same music or wear the same clothes at 15 as I do now. So why am I on the same medication, and why hasn't this been changed? Like, my brain has got to be different and more mature and developed. So I figured a baseline was the way to go. What I didn't know was that I thought it would be a matter of, cutting my dosages in half for a week or two, hanging out without any drugs for a month, and then saying, okay, what's the next process? I didn't realize that what was about to happen is that I was going to end up in severe withdrawal for over a year because of these drugs. So my assumption of what was going to happen was very, very wrong. But the instinct was just to try and figure out, well, really, who the hell am I without these drugs? I don't know.
So have you come down to the conclusion, because again, you ask the question a lot in the book, how much of this is withdrawal and how much of this is me finally having to feel what I'm feeling, and experience what I'm experiencing, and without the medication?
In retrospect and looking now, withdrawal was very specific. And a lot of people ask me this, they say, well, how do I know if I'm having a relapse, or if I actually, having another problem, or if it's withdrawal? And in my case, and, the cases that I, and the people I talk to, the general assumption is, well, did this start when you stopped taking the drugs? Yeah. And then in some cases, people say, well, if you reinstate, if you go back on a little bit of it, does it go away? I never reinstated, so I never got to test that. But it was a night and day difference from pretty much the day, if I took my last drug on a Monday and then didn't have one on a Tuesday, there was a world of difference that happened. So I knew for sure. And now, especially having been so many years out of it, I'm now 6 years since I've taken my last antidepressant. I see such a difference between my day-to-day now and my day-to-day in withdrawal that I know what withdrawal was specifically.
Got it.
The caveat of that, though, is that I also started doing very, very deep emotional work that I had not done previously.
So what ask you about Alan?
Yeah. So what I don't know is, had I not done that work, how much I might be stuck in the, emotional volatility of post-SSRI, post-SNRI life. That I don't know, but that's because I did so much emotional work for that year.
Alan, and how you came upon Alan and his teachings about, well, just to put it simply, probably oversimplifying it, about self-compassion. When you said, I don't even know what that means. What do you mean, compassion? What
does that mean? I have compassion for yourself. What is that? Sorcery. That's how I felt. Exactly. So I very much struggled with traditional therapy or talk therapy. And a big reason was because I had a lot of memory loss from the time period that my father died and I was medicated. So I just kind of struggled to connect or go through your standard protocols when I couldn't actually remember anything from that period of time. It was infuriating to me. It was infuriating to anyone I would work with. And so I just gave up. And so within withdrawal, I'd say about 3 months in, was probably the peak where kind of all the physical side effects, the cognitive side effects, the psychological side effects, and the emotional side effects were all going on all at once. And it was to the point where I just was barely functioning in day-to-day life because I was so angry. I didn't trust myself to really be in public because I always just felt like I was about to snap. And it just, I knew I needed some help. Mm-hmm. And around that time, my mom had been, we have the context here is that she's an angel on earth. So she had been listening to some podcast that, she'd probably never listened to before. And there this man was, Alan. And she just called me and she said, I think you should contact him. It just feels like he might help. And, and I was open at that point. I mean, when you're so desperate, you will do anything, even if it seems like the most out of left field wackadoodle thing. So I contacted him, and his website's, very kind of like, there are a lot of buzzwords like, miracles and transformation and, all these things where I was just looking at it saying to myself, well, that's a load of crap, but whatever, I'm desperate. And I ended up talking to him, and our entire relationship ended up being remote over the phone well before that was, a thing. But for me, that was so important because I didn't like sitting in front of someone and kind of seeing their facial reactions to what I was saying. So this put a huge barrier in between us. Also, I was safe in my own apartment, which was important because I didn't necessarily feel safe to go out into the world. So I got to start in my apartment and end in my apartment and then immediately go, sleep or whatever I needed to do. So that was also really important. But more than that is, he sort of blended Eastern and Western modalities together. And in the end, it ended up being this very self-compassion based therapy where he would kind of intuit what needed to be said, and I would repeat it back. And we would work with the metaphorical images in my mind or the symbols, as opposed to a rooted memory that had actually occurred. And so because of the memory loss, that was so important, because always what came in for me was, it seemed like I was reading a fantasy novel in my head.
Mm-hmm.
So to be able to work with those images, as opposed to, let's talk about the 15-year-old Brooke and how sad she was, right? Which I couldn't connect to. His process really allowed me to connect and start processing all of the emotion and grief that I really had never been able to process.
You're quoting him, and he says, "My belief is that we go piece by piece. We examine the broken piece, heal it with our own compassion, and put the fixed piece back in. Then we take another piece, we pull it out, and we work with it. Eventually, there becomes a cumulative benefit, an acceleration process, like putting a puzzle together."
Mm-hmm.
That reminded me of the Japanese kintsugi practice, where they take something that's broken and put gold where the broken pieces are. I got this image of kids. I'm probably crucifying the word, but
yeah, I had that image a lot too. I think I almost titled it something along those lines, but that didn't happen. But it was always on my mind.
Yeah.
And I think it's true. I mean,
do you still work with Alan?
I don't work with him anymore. He doesn't really work with people one-on-one anymore, but he trained a bunch of practitioners all over the world. So I still will sometimes work with one of the practitioners he trained in the process. Wonderful. And my mother now works in this process too, after seeing
how nice
what happened to me. So it's kind of cool. I get to see her just have this huge positive transformational effect on the people that she works for or with, because of this experience I had. And we've got a little mother-daughter duo going on.
Well, when I was reading the book, and then your relationship with Alan came along, and what I liked about it, I've been a therapist for 30 years, but what I liked about it is that there were things that needed to happen internally.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking a lot about your experiences out in the world and on all these different countries, and handling the chaos of, I don't even know a better word than that.
That's the right word.
Okay. What was going on with you physically, somatically. Just trying to rediscover yourself, but it was nice because to me, it points out that you weren't alone, that you sought someone and his voice was like something you could come back to. Yep. And, I know he went out of the country one time, there was an earthquake or something where he was.
Yeah, hurricane came through.
Yeah, and he wasn't available, but by that time I think you were okay. But he was just like a beam, just something you could grasp to make sure. And because I'm a firm believer in reaching out for help when you need it. Mm-hmm. So, not necessarily through medication, but now I want to point out, for anybody who's on medication, who's listening to this, you're not saying, "Oh, you shouldn't be on medication."
My work is particularly around withdrawal. So,
right.
There's a lot I would change about our system and the way we medicate people if I was in charge. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is that there are some people who want to stay on these drugs forever, and there are some people who don't. Right. And for the people who don't, we have to be able to pull them off safely, and we have to empower them and trust that they know what's best for them. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of gaslighting in this industry about whether or not people should be medicated. But at the end of the day, I think you have to respect the patient. You have to respect what they want. And, I've fought all of this, and I'm just so glad that I had the strength to push through, because withdrawal was the hardest thing I've ever been through. And it was also the greatest gift and teacher I've ever experienced. Mm-hmm. And my life now is what I always thought it could be, what I wanted it to be. But I had to work for it, and I had to go against the traditional system in order to actually get here. And it shouldn't be that hard. It just shouldn't be that hard, nor should 15-year-olds be medicated indefinitely and no one follows up on it. There's so many problems here, but we need to be able to take people off these drugs safely. Sure. And we just don't know how, and the information is not out there right now.
There are some doctors who are very, very aware of it and guide their patients through it, but it's not the norm for certainly not my experience.
It's not the norm, and it's a pretty recent shift. I mean, even when I started writing the book in 2017, it was far less available. This information was far less available than it is now. Mm-hmm. My frustration now, though, is that we do have researchers who are working on this, and they're doing great work. And so this shouldn't be happening, but I still hear every day some doctors tossed someone on or pulled someone off some absurd high dose of whatever drug, and these people are just suffering, and it's just makes me want to pull my hair out because the research is there. We have it. It's good research. You can go to Google Scholar or PubMed and find it, or Twitter. It's like right there. I can understand it. I'm not a researcher. Like, it's not that difficult to understand either. So why is this not spreading like wildfire? I don't understand.
Well, I can eloquent about that myself.
Right. And then like the reality is I do kind of understand because it's being squashed and blah, blah, blah. But and people are in pain, and I know it's all just tricky, but there's hope out there for people who want to get off these drugs, and there's ways to do it.
Well, I think your book is a wonderful example of can happen, but also, I mean, it's a very, I don't want to call it entertaining. It's a learning. I felt like I was learning as I read. And it was also, you write so beautifully, and just, I could picture exactly where you were and who you were with and what was happening inside of you and outside of you. And that was very unexpected, this is going to be about side effects and blah, 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 blah. So it was just a lovely.
Well, I'm glad it was entertaining. It's supposed to be like,
yeah. Well,
it's a story.
It wasn't like funny, entertaining, but there were some funny parts. I mean, you with the motorcycle, for example. It was, and the scuba diving and all that stuff was like,
I designed it and wrote it with the intention of having there be a lot of tension and good storytelling, right? The best causes are told through storytelling. So I wanted this to stick with people. And I think even if you're not interested in the topic, it's worth a read because it's a good book.
Oh, it's about traveling around the world and what kind of experiences you can have. And I didn't know whether I was going to go to Kuala Lumpur or not. I would definitely think about it before I went.
Not my favorite place. Yeah, not my favorite place, but a lot of people loved it.
Thank you so very much. And we should throw in that through all this, you also won Chopped.
I did. Yes. My day job is a chef. I sometimes, again, I feel like I'm in some little alternate universe because I have these really often difficult, hard conversations with people about this topic. And then I go downstairs and make cookies. It's kind of nice, but also a little weird. I still work as a chef because that's how I pay my bills. Being writers aren't exactly known for their riches. So I work as a chef, and I was the Food Network Chopped champion. It's season 32, episode 6. I was in withdrawal. Yeah, I was in withdrawal at the time. So it's actually, I think, interesting if you read the book and then go watch the episode to kind of see a little bit if you can tell what was going on or not. Mm-hmm. My mom says that she could tell what was going on, but that I'm a very good actress. So
well, I'll have to go watch it and see what it's like. But anyway, because I love Chopped as many people do. Thank you so much. I know you're busy, Brooke. Thank you. I thoroughly recommend the book to anybody who's either been on antidepressants, is thinking about going on antidepressants. And again, just anyone who wants to read this very rich story of you becoming stable and making peace with so much of yourself.
I would also really encourage that parents of tweens and teens read this book, because I know that is such a constant thing that they're facing is whether or not medicating their child is the right choice. Right. And there's a lot of reflection in the sense that we know, my mom and I talk about this a lot. We would have made different choices had we know what we know now. Mm-hmm. So I think that this book is unique in that it kind of can show one timeline from that choice that we didn't know. But I've heard from a lot of parents that they're glad they read it of young people. So
we should also point out, it doesn't always happen. I mean, I've been on antidepressants twice, and I didn't have any problem getting off of them at all. Yep. So you can't guarantee on that kind of experience, but you can't guarantee mine either.
Yeah.
So, there you go.
And it's about 50-50, the research says. So it's a little bit of a coin flip. And I just think informed consent, true informed consent, where people have an understanding of all of the possibilities is what we need here. And I hope that my book helps fill that gap a little.
Thank you so very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. Thanks again so much for being here. I know that you have a lot of podcasts you could be listening to, and I'm very, very honored that you're here at Self Work. Tell your friends, tell people that you think need therapy. Maybe those people are your friends, maybe they aren't. You can subscribe at drmargaretrutherford.com, or you can subscribe where you listen and leave a rating or review. That's always incredibly appreciated. Thanks again for being here. I'll be with you again this week with another wonderful interview and a very different kind of interview for self-work. I'll be interested to see what you think. Please take very good care. I'm Dr. Margaret, and this has been Self-Work.